Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Fabian Friends of the ABC Forum on the state of the Fourth Estate. I know there's a few more people coming in, but I think we might get started now that our speakers and Hugh are here. My name is Mary Delahunty. I'm a long-time journalist and a shorter-time minister, but always interested and keenly involved in ideas and words that build bridges between ideas. So we were delighted to be part of this notion of let's having a look at the state of the Fourth Estate in Australia at the moment. This forum was really prompted by the federal government, another federal government review of public broadcasting, the ABC and SBS. And I do draw your attention to some material that's sitting on your chairs, which is a petition you might like to sign to the board of the ABC, and also reference and material around this ABC-SBS review. And if you do wish to put in a submission, however small or large, and we'd encourage that, of course, they must be in by Friday the 12th of December. And I know that the Friends of the ABC would be very keen to help you if you need assistance in that. It was also prompted by seemingly an increasing frenzy about the state of journalism in Australia, the state of newspapers and public broadcasting in Australia, and a sense of foreboding among some people about the chill winds of change that are blowing through journalism. Now, I'm sure there's lots of people in this room who may have read about or remember the frenzied reaction when television was first introduced into Australia in the 50s. And I wasn't there, but I remember reading about it, that was going to be the end of newspapers when television came into our homes. We would no longer need newspapers. So now we face the digital internet revolution, and that's a great challenge for journalism. We're very, very fortunate to tonight have three experienced, successful and very thoughtful speakers. They are Michael Gawenda, Ramona Koval, Eric Beecher, and I will, of course, introduce them in more detail when they get up to speak. But they come from, if you like, a very, very vast years of experience, all of them. They come from print, from broadcasting, and increasingly now online. The format tonight is a speaker's presentation to you. Then we'll have a conversation between the four of us, and I do stress it will be a conversation where we'll try and tease out where are we with journalism in Australia, where could we be, and where should we be. And of course lots of other things will come up on that journey. We'll invite you towards the end if you have any questions, and our speakers are all very happy to take questions. This is being recorded tonight, so we would ask you to turn off all of these devices, mobile phones, Blackberries, Palm Trios, all the rest of it, because it does interfere with the microphones and the recording, so we'll ask you to do that. So I think that's not a bad format, so let's kick it off with our first speaker, which is Michael Gawenda. Now, Michael's career spans 3 decades. He's been a political reporter, a foreign correspondent based in London and in Washington. He's been a columnist, a feature writer and an editor. He's won 3 Walkley Awards, and they're not easy to win. It all began for Michael at the Age back in 1970. He was a political correspondent in Canberra, a London correspondent. He was senior editor, Time magazine, editor and editor-in-chief of the Age, Washington correspondent, and most recently, of course, he is the author of American Notebook, a personal and political journey, which was published last year. He's the inaugural director of the University of Melbourne's Centre for the Advanced Study of Journalism and continues as a columnist for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. We're really pleased to have Michael speaking to us tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Gawenda.
Thanks, Mary, for that introduction. I want to say, firstly, I want to correct something that you just said. I remain a columnist for the Sydney Morning Herald, but the Age has decided it no longer wants me as a columnist. I don't know whether that has anything to do with the fact that I made a speech at Melbourne University in which I had some critical things to say about Fairfax and the management of Fairfax and the direction in which the papers are going. It may have had something to do with that, or it may be just that the Age now believes that it has better columnists than me. And that may well be the case. We always have to be open to all possibilities. As I listened to Mary, I thought of listened to her describe what I've done in 30 years in newspaper journalism. I thought to myself, is it possible that a young journalist starting out today as a newspaper journalist has got a 30-year career ahead of them in newspaper journalism and will get the chance to do the sort of things that I did as a newspaper journalist, travel a lot apart from the postings that I had, sent all over the world for stories, be given time by editors to do things that sometimes took stories that sometimes took a month or two to research and write, be based in Washington and in London and New York, which were expensive things to postings to fund. Is that possible? Is that going to happen? I know there are a couple of young journalists here tonight who are at the beginning of their time in newspapers. I don't want to be a pessimist, but I do think that the chances of someone starting out today being able to do the things that I did in newspapers are not all that good. The other thing that I thought as I sat down here and looked at the signs behind me, are they gone? That this was jointly sponsored by this forum, jointly sponsored by the Friends of the ABC and by the Fabians. I wondered why it wasn't jointly sponsored by the Friends of the Age and the ABC and the Fabians. And how many supporters of the Age, I mean, there was a time when Gough Whitlam and Malcolm Fraser and thousands of people turned up to rallies to defend the Age. How many people would turn up today if there were rallies like that called? I've no answer to that. I don't want to be too pessimistic, but the fact is that newspapers are in trouble. I spent close to 3 years in Washington until about a year ago, which gave me a chance to travel around America and look in part at what was happening to their newspapers. And their newspapers are in big trouble. And that includes the great newspapers, the Washington Post, the New York Times, even the Wall Street Journal. They're losing circulation and revenue, and while they haven't put off a lot of journalists, I think that possibility is a real one for even the best newspapers in the US. The second-tier newspapers are really, really in dire straits. If you have a look, even the Los Angeles Times, which was a top-tier newspaper, has gone from a staff of 1,300 to a staff of just over 600. It's so close to half its staff have been put off. Its circulation was once 1.1 million. Its circulation now is around 650,000. It is a dying newspaper. Some very good newspapers, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Boston Globe, the Chicago Tribune, which once were in their own cities were really, really good newspaper. The San Francisco Chronicle, which wasn't a bad paper. These papers now are really, really ordinary papers. Their staffs have been cut. Their best journalists have left, and the circulation and revenue and readership is plummeting. Now, what came first? Well, the fact is that circulations of newspapers in America and Australia and in Britain, for that matter, have been falling for some time. Up and down a bit, but nevertheless the trend has been downwards. And certainly when you take population growth into account, the newspapers really have a downward trend in terms of readership and circulation. In Britain at the moment, I think it would be a brave person that said, for instance, that the Independent and the Independent on Sunday is going to survive for very long. I think it's close to dying now. The Express newspapers are close to death. The Daily Telegraph, which was once the great conservative newspaper in Britain, is cutting 20% of its staff as we speak. And I believe it's not a shadow of the paper that it was 15 years ago. In Australia, I think that we are a few years behind. I thought we were a few years behind the United States in terms of the broken economic model for newspapers, that it was still possible that Australia had a few years to go before we were in the sort of position that US newspapers or UK newspapers are in, but I think that's no longer true. Fairfax recently cut close to 20% of its editorial staff on the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. And that was before it was clear that this economic downturn is going to be severe and is going to severely impact revenue beyond what could be seen when those cuts were made. So I think it's inevitable that there will be more cuts. I think that I have no doubt that there needs to be a new model for newspapers. I'm not going to talk about the growth of digital journalism. Eric can talk about that, and maybe Ramona can too. I was asked to talk specifically about newspapers. I think that newspapers have to change drastically. I think that they have to be smaller, more focused. I'm talking about serious newspapers. I'm talking about broadsheet newspapers like The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. They have to be left. They have to get rid of lifestyle sections. They have to focus on news and commentary and good writing. They have to be smaller in size. They have to accept that there's going to be that circulation will decline. They'll have to look at charging more for the paper. But to charge more from the paper, it's got to be a downside better than it is at the moment. And I think that is the future of newspapers. It may not even be, this paper may not even be published every day. It may be published 3 or 4 times a week. But without a plan like that, without a real look at what can survive in the medium term in terms of print, what's going to happen is that there's just going to be decline. There's going to be more and more cuts. Management will continue to say we're in favour of quality journalism and we can do it with fewer and fewer people, which of course is a nonsense. It's not possible to do that unless you're a magician of some sort. And I can tell you the management of Fairfax, they're not magicians. So unless there is a real attempt to look at what's the future of these papers, how do you reconfigure them so that they'll work? That may require fewer journalists, and different sorts of journalists. But without doing that, all that's going to happen is that, especially with the economic downturn that we have now, these newspapers are going to continue to decline, costs will continue to be cut, and I can now envisage something that I didn't envisage until recently, a time when The Age, which has been part of Melbourne's life for more than 150 years, will be seriously under threat. Somebody before mentioned the Argus. Well, some of us are old enough to remember the Argus, and I reckon there was a time, I can barely remember it, I was a kid, but I can remember the Argus, and my dad bought the Argus, and I can remember that there was great shock that when the Argus died, because no one believes that these institutions do die. But I can now foresee a time when the Age will be seriously under threat. If that time hasn't arrived, it isn't very far away. I'm sorry to be so pessimistic, but perhaps Eric will inject a note of optimism into this. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and that was the perspective from newspapers at the moment. Now to Ramona Koval, who, of course, is well known to all of you. Ramona is a broadcaster, a journalist and a writer. She presents the wonderful book show on ABC Radio National. She's been at the ABC full-time since 1988. She's worked in local radio, she's worked on documentaries, she's written columns and articles for newspapers, and her interviews have been collated into a book form. Both here and overseas, she's written for literary journals. She is the author of one novel and a collection of interviews and a Jewish cookbook for anyone who's interested in something to cook. Ramona was also the staff-elected director on the ABC board between 2002 and 2006. Ladies and gentlemen, Ramona Koval.
I was just remembering how I got into journalism because Michael was telling us about his story. I just should say that I was trained as a scientist, and I discovered in the laboratory that it wasn't as much fun as I thought it was going to be, because it was a lot of repetitive work, repeating the same old thing and finding out one thing. And it turned out that I was really interested in ideas, and I was basically incredibly curious. And it took me quite a long time, but I discovered that journalism was the place for the incredibly curious. And it was so much fun, and it was also marvellous the way it gave you an entree into people's lives and to the laboratories of all the people that I couldn't be, but they could just tell me what they'd discovered at the end, and I wouldn't have to go through the boring bit. And that was marvellous. So I learnt my skills while I was teaching at RMIT across the road and playing at Triple R. And then with my silly science program, and I got invited to do some things for the science unit at the ABC, and then moved on to sort of general journalism. And I remember walking into the ABC in Lonsdale Street, the radio station, and just thinking it was the most marvellous, incredible place. All these people were doing really interesting things. They knew things about all kinds of stuff that I was really keen to know about. And you could turn on your radio and you could hear these fantastic things all day and all night, all year. And I thought, I really want to work here. I'd love to be part of it. And that's really how I came to work at the ABC 20 years ago. This idea that people comment about the digital future of the ABC and some of the questions that the government's asking people to comment on, you should all read them, and you should all talk about them and enter into this discussion. It's very important that you do. It's all about multi-channelling and multi-platform media environments and broadbands and internets and new technology platforms. and efficiencies and all of this kind of thing. And in a sense, a lot of these questions are ponderings about the pipes, in fact, how stuff gets from us to you, and the other way around more and more these days in the digital environment, that we're open to hear from audiences much more than we were. And of course we need to say yes, 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 yes to making our stuff more accessible and available to people all over the planet, no matter if they're played on the radio or they're podcasting or Twittering, or whether you've still got a Bakelite radio or a Crystal set. Podcasting has actually been hugely responsible for really saving Radio National, I think. All the talk that used to happen a few years ago about a small group of people making specialist programs and nobody listens to them. Well, up to September this year, Radio National's monthly average podcast downloads was 1.7 million per month. So somewhere in the world, 1.7 million people are downloading our programs and listening to them. And I get letters now from people in Anchorage and in China and in India and everywhere, just commenting on the last interview or suggesting a new writer it's just fantastic. So I'm a great believer in the new media, and I think it's very important for us to be part of it and available on all these platforms. And, children's content, of course, a separate channel for kids, why not? Combining ABC and SBS operations to improve efficiencies without compromising their separate identities, good idea. The only reason we need to say about without compromising our separate identities is, of course, SBS takes ads, and if we mixed it all together, that would be a bad idea. I think we should think about changing the charter of the ABC. We should do for the so-called new media and everything else that might arise in our unknown technological future. We should say, like we said about TV and radio, that it should be a non-commercial environment, and I can talk about that in a moment as well. But my interest is not so much in the pipes, although I'm a bit of a tech head. My interest is in the content, the use of journalism from respected and trusted sources. Now, I'll give you just an example from my own show. Do you want to hear a book review from a knowledgeable person who's read lots of the author's work, or read in that area of expertise that the author's writing about, or has something interesting to say and has the language to say it? Or should I just look up an Amazon review? Now, if you want me to organise the best book review I can, you have to let me read all the literary journals, read all kinds of newspapers, read all kinds of books, interview people carefully, having read them carefully. You might also want me to send producers to, say, a creative writing class to sit there for a few weeks and make a little documentary feature about what it's like to be in a creative writing class, or to investigate new writing at a literary festival somewhere up the coast of New South Wales, or to go to a conference and work out who are the best people, who are having the most interesting ideas, who can communicate them best in a way that is understandable for all of us. All this takes time, it takes effort, of course it takes funding. I was listening to a show today, this afternoon, about, it was a Remembering Studs Terkel, who died at the end of October, a most eminent oral historian and best remembered for his oral histories of common American people. He had a very, very long-running radio show broadcast daily for the best of 50 years on Chicago public radio. He was 96, and he said something. He said eventually most thinking people come through their teens and 20s and even 30s and ask themselves the question that we've all been asking since before antiquity. Who am I? Where am I going? What is truth? What is beauty? What is death? How should we live? How does the world work? And how do we know? All these kind of questions are out there. The answers are out there in internet land, but it's a hell of a difficult task to gather them in a form which is understandable. And he quoted Hannah Arendt saying, that she, of course, wrote a book covering the Adolf Eichmann trial called Eichmann in Jerusalem, and she coined that phrase, the banality of evil. And on that show today, Studs Terkel talked about the reverse, the evil of banality. And that's what we're, suffering from in this new world, which is, there's so much to choose from. Where do we go? Who do we listen to? How much time have we got to find it out? I mean, you can see the trouble that newspapers are having trying to work out how to make a buck on the internet and to get the kinds of incomes that will not only bring their investors dividends but fund large groups of journalists to do all the things that Michael was just telling you about. And I don't know anybody in journalism, except perhaps from some people in the Australian newspaper, who thinks that there's no place for a well-funded and well-respected public broadcaster. And so often you hear people talking about the future of journalism, the future of newspapers, and people will say, well, of course, there's the ABC, and we have to remember that that's there and it will be there, and that's, of course, very important. But it's the last 10, 12 years showed that it's not necessarily always going to be there. And it was very difficult to be at the ABC. It was very difficult to be on the board of the ABC from 2002 to 2006. And in my opinion, the government of the day chose to be quite mischievous in putting people on the board who did not even believe in public broadcasting. I mean, it would be as if you put people on the board of the BHP who didn't believe in mining. I mean, wouldn't that be idiotic? But that's, in my opinion, what happened. So it became the plaything of the government. And, I think in about 5 minutes, the Rudd government will hate the ABC. It's what happens all the time. People get very annoyed about giving money to organisations and then having them criticise you. It's kind of understandable. The trick is to guard that independence very, very, very firmly. And I am encouraged by this new idea about appointments to the ABC board by having a separate group to evaluate nominations from the public. It would be great if people were appointed to the board who cared about public broadcasting, knew something about journalism and broadcasting, really had a sense of the importance of the organisation.